second question. You sort of covered this in your answers, but how do we get into this situation? How do we get into these wars, and how do we get into violent size it is now?
Well, I'm more conceptually oriented, and let my brother and sister here handle math. But this is a position. After World War II, the establishment of the United Nations, the development of spheres of interest, where parts of the world were turned over to different hegemons. The Soviets would get X, the US would get Y, France would be allowed to keep its colonies if they could keep them, England would be allowed to keep its colonies, and even Korea was considered all outside of the American sphere of interest. Now, Keynes and others have argued that deficit spending is nothing wrong with it, as long as you're using deficit spending to supply needed resources and rebuilding. And of course, a lot of things have been held up by World War II. Part of the rebuilding should have been a simple, we need to rebuild the road system like the Germans did with the Autobahn. We need an American expressway system. Just because it's good to have it, and also we want to shift everybody from railroads to cars. And that would have been a logical decision. But instead of coming up with a simple peacetime theory of why we need the interstates, they came up with a military rationale. Because they were preparing us for a whole continuation of war by another means. There were a section of the American political economic elite that really saw the possibility of destroying the Soviet Union as a rival power in the world. They had assumed that the immense destruction had been brought down against the Soviets by the Germans, 20 million dead, huge cities either destroyed by the Germans or destroyed by the scorched earth policy, where you blow up your own cities, you blow up your dams, you blow up all the things that have been built. They figured it would take the Russians maybe 10 years, and in that time, the United States could, in fact, launch a preventive war. But they couldn't tell us that because 45, 46, 47, we were still in this peacetime. The war is over, people are coming back, we got to take care of our GIs. We had all these wonderful social programs that needed federal funding that were exactly needed to reconstruct America, which had been, so there was sort of a pause between 39 and 45. And people argued, frankly, that the United States never really got out of the Depression until the war took place. And certainly I remember, I guess again, coming out of my own autobiography, how many black folks came to Detroit and other industrial areas of the South to take part in this tremendous money being unleashed by the federal government and the military machine. So without having all the details in mind, I saw the theory of Keynes, that is deficit spending is positive if you rebuild your society, suddenly was turned around in 47, 48, and 49 with the revival of anti-communism, with the revival of the theory of the loose foundation of those guys, with the need to control oil as now a new mandate from the Rockefeller side of the ruling circle. Putting all those factors together, there was a need now to continue war. Not so bad as to have bombs falling on the United States or even on Moscow, but the third world would be the arena in which the wars would take place. Korea would begin. And don't, so you can't interrupt, sir.
We couldn't handle peace.
Excuse me, my brother, please.
There'll be a question and answer.
There you go. Relax. Where was I? Oh yeah. So how do we get into this? A perversion of Keynes that federal money must be constantly injected into the society to keep it going and to complete the so-called end of the Depression. It works over World War II, right out through World War II and a half, World War II and a quarter, World War II and 3/8. That's enough war to keep the industrial machinery going. But something began to happen with the plan. Whereas the theory of a war-based economy was supposed to sort of get everybody a little taste. We were building tanks, we were building airplanes, we were building B-52 bombers. Gradually, and war bonds, of course, was another way in which the war was funded in the World War II model. Now we had to come up with a form of investment inside of the military-industrial complex, not based so much upon war bonds and war stamps, but on taxation concept. Now, the taxation rates, they tell me from this movie I saw called Capitalism, a Love Story, it was very high. But because of the consumption dynamic that had been unleashed by this new military-industrial energy, by the credit that was a little cheaper in those days, by the need to buy housing, the Levittown, the creation of suburbia, there was a kind of a feedback into the normal economy from this new war-based machinery. A war in which we didn't get ourselves killed in large numbers, but enough people got killed to make it pretty bloody. If you would ask anybody who died in Korea, anybody who died in Vietnam. but slowly borrowing money to maintain the war in order to hide the true cost of the war, which took place under the Johnson administration. The theory of borrowing money from somebody, either American banks or German banks, whoever had the money, let us fund the war by borrowing it, so as to give the illusion we have bread and butter. And so this whole kind of bulge began to take place, beginning in 65, 68, 72, big bulge of borrowing money in order to fund the empire. And to give us the illusion that we were not really suffering from this expansion and all this weaponry. Well, the bubble broke in the period, the so-called Clinton period, which everybody says had all of this surplus, which I really don't see, but there's a way in which they tricked us with the theory of the Clintonian surplus, maybe you all can help us with. But the point became, after the Clinton period, with the rise of the Bush administration, there was no real money left to really fund the kind of war that was being planned, the so-called low-intensity conflict against terrorists. No more big tanks on the field type war, but maybe blowing up a village or blowing up a town or killing some, quote, ragheads in an Afghan village or the Iraqi area. So with that type of economy that's based on debt, with that kind of, you have to wait, please.
No accountability whatsoever.
That's right. So to sum it up, that tension between the need to maintain an empire without too much suffering from the U.S. American people to make it happen, using the power of the state to borrow money, using the power to print all the money over to the Treasury Department, we have a hollowed out political economic system now. And now the piper must be paid. The kind of retrenchment and stripping of all the rights we thought were built into our old New Deal model are now imploding. And in a real sense, here it comes, that which has been delayed all these years by us bleeding the third world dry. Our turn on the wheel has come.
Yeah, I'd like to, when I started, actually, way sooner last time, I'd like to deepen that a little bit. The period from 1946 to 1976, was a period of great prosperity for capitalism in America. And the coming out of the Second World War and the destruction that was caused by it, in fact, we were the only industrial power in the United States, in the world at that time, created enormous markets for U.S. goods, for U.S. capital. And that led to a period of prosperity for most people, not for everyone. But, what? I'm sorry, but what happened, and I don't know if you can see this chart, the key fact was that in the period from 46 to 76, as the national income rose, the average income of about 90% of the people went up there. It tracked it pretty close. While the average income for the top 1% of the people went up, but much less. So that the post-World War II welfare state was not providing the top 1% in the corporations, especially by the time they were in the 70s, with the profits and the income they felt needed to expand production. A crisis ensued in that period. And out of that crisis, there arose a new, what the economists call a mode of accumulation, that the post-World War sort of compromised between capital and labor, in which labor would get a cut, the rise of productivity was liquidated. And instead we entered into called the neoliberal period, which in fact meant privatization and the attack on the welfare state. And the attempted return to an earlier pre-New Deal period. And if you look at, I don't know if you see this, but well, between 1946 and 1976, the average income of about 90% of the population tracked that increased retirement income. Between 1976 and 2007, the income of the top increased about 300% more than the national, 600% more than the national income. And the increase for the bottom 90% was negligible, it didn't exist. Between 1976 and 2007, basically the income, real income of the massive population remained static. So this is a whole new transformation. And that would be the basic economics behind the rise in military expenditures and the rise in the imperial regime that proceeded in that, continued in that period. Because the rise in the income of the top 1% was a rise in income of the financial sector, primarily. And that financial sector was dependent on the regime of international finance and trade that involved a closer domination of the third world and the rest of the world. And the military would have to guarantee that. In that period, for example, South America went through disaster. There's no growth in South America during the 80s and 90s, etc. That led to enormous social conflict. That social conflict had to be contained militarily. That military containment was dependent on U.S. military and U.S. military expenditure. So that we had both troops in Latin America, but we also had billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars, financing, militias and their private armies down there to suppress the social decay of that period, social disintegration of that period. It was even more true in Africa, and where the decline in Africa was disastrous. Again, this led to mass social upheaval. Mass social upheaval leads to a strengthening, a necessary strengthening of the military and the arms, because that's the way you can maintain that social upheaval. So that briefly is the description, the better underlying economic description of why, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was this massive expansion of military power. And it seemed the rationale for it disappeared, but in fact, under the underlying economics forced that to happen, and it forces it today. We are still in that.
There's, just looking at the budget, how it currently is, one of the reasons why we get into these wars, and I'm going to touch on what they were talking about as well, but one of the reasons is that we simply don't have the funding for anything like diplomacy or foreign assistance and things like that. We've taken those out of the budget, but we have this whole military budget, so if there's something going on, we shoot you or bomb you, and that's help. That's the way that we provide our aid and assistance, and because that's all that we have the money for. Or that's how we have the money appropriated. It's not that we don't have the money for other things. So essentially, diplomacy and talking things through are not even a functional part of our government at this point. Our military is, it's big and huge and can do just about anything we need it to by force. And they were talking about how that happened and in the 1950s, that it was a huge push toward that. Dr. Campbell mentioned the Strategic Air Command, and the other side of that was the CIA. Those agencies existed before, but they didn't exist on that level. They were given almost unlimited funding in terms of what the government could do in order to expand what they can do. And the CIA was all about intelligence. How do we find out about everything before it happens? And so they started setting up things everywhere, all over the world, so that we could figure out how to catch things before they happen. And Strategic Air Command was in charge of building up our arsenal. And how many bombs can we have? How many bombs would it take to wipe the Soviet Union off the map? And then let's build more close. And so they built up the arsenal. By the time that they even decided how many they would need for that, they already had enough. And they continued to build more, so that they would be able to do whatever they wanted. Basically, it was like flexing your muscles and showing everybody that you were really strong. And that's what we were looking for with our military, is that we wanted to look like the biggest and baddest, person on the block, so that everyone was afraid and wouldn't start the wars with us, so that we wouldn't have to. It was preventative measures, but at the same time, it wasn't. It was a very offensive strategy. And we can argue whether that was right or wrong per se, but that's what happened. And that's ever since then, every president, every administration that's come in since then has supported that strategy. And we as citizens, and I say we, whether you agree or not, just collectively, that we support this because we've been told that this is how we ensure our freedom. That if we fight this, if we have this huge military, if we have this industrial military complex, that no one can never attack us and no one can never do anything. We saw that that was wrong at 9/11, right? That we had a huge attack and we had attacks before then and we've had failed military strategies at different times, so it doesn't guarantee anything. It just makes us have that image that we can do this. So now, at this point, we have about 760 bases all over the world, military bases, because we need to know what's going on everywhere at all times. We have to have all kinds of troops in all these different countries at every given point so that we can stay at our power. So that's a little bit briefer than what they gave, but a little bit more broken down of how we got here in terms of the idea that this was a strategy. It wasn't something that just happened. It was a decision that was made to get us to this point.